Once again, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome Dr. Ross King with a loud and warm round of applause.
Well, good evening, everybody. And first of all, thank you to Gera and to Dr. Yang for your kind words and your words of introduction. I'm afraid you may have set expectations too high for the audience. I'm also a little bit intimidated by the number of people in the audience. I'm not used to speaking to large crowds, and I'm especially not used to being that speaker standing between all of you and dinner. So I know that I probably have 45 minutes, which is not a lot of time. And I do have a series of slides, which I'm not going to read my paper. You have my paper if you really want to read a shortened version of it in front of you. But going through some of the slides, I would like to hit some of the highlights and hope that I've got it timed more or less right so that we can leave at least 10 minutes at the end. I'm sure there are both opinions and questions in the audience about this topic, although I'm not sure I'll be able to answer a lot of the questions. Now, as was already mentioned by Dr. Yang, North Korea is in the news a lot lately. But of course, most of what we see, and this is a bit of a frustration of mine as a researcher, we see so much about nuclear weapons and about international relations and national security. So, all of our colleagues in those fields, of course, are very busy these days, but we rarely hear much about North Korean culture. And of course, it's not easy to do research on North Korean culture, but this particular topic has been of interest to me for a while, and I actually owe it to my suffering wife, who one day about a few years ago noticed in the South Korean press this very short, enigmatic report of a particular article that had appeared in the North Korean language planning journals, and so that's where this all starts. So let me just start talking to the slides. So this very first image here, these are typical covers of a journal called Munhwa Hakseop, which means something like cultured language learning. Munhwa is what the North Koreans call their standardized version of Korean, and it is allegedly based on Pyongyang sort of workers' speech. Fairly typical. Nowadays, they don't actually put bright covers on anymore, I guess because it's just too expensive. But these are presumably read by K to 12 or even K to 16, if you will, sort of, school, elementary, middle, high school, even university, teachers and instructors in Korean language. That's the target of these journals. And these are language planning journals that essentially give advice about the language, little articles about this and that, a little bit of literature, but mostly about language and to help teachers in the classroom in North Korea. Well, this particular journal in 2013 ran an article that had the title, "Let Us Hold Fast to the Purity of Pyongyang Cultured Language," with a big exclamation point. All of their articles are these exhortations to revolutionary activity. And so that's a fairly standard kind of article to find, but what was really strange about this particular article was that it was concerned with women's speech and about linguistic politeness in particular. And there was a kind of paranoia in the article about, quote, invasions of capitalistic elements into the language. And so the article went on, quote, "Certain people now, few though they may be, evince phenomena whereby they muddy elegant and wholesome social linguistic morale by speaking completely unabashedly in a conspicuous and strange manner and intonation." They never name South Korean speech forms. They never name South Korea as the target, but it's clear that what is meant is South Korean forms. And they list a number of typical kind of South Korean, if you will, verb forms, and go on to say that using these forms, if you're a North Korean, especially using them to your superiors, runs counter to morality. So there's this concern with morality, and that it recklessly confounds the speech level endings. I'm assuming also, by the way, that many of you are at one level or another learning, struggling with this very difficult language, which has all of these complex honorifics and speech levels. So this article claims then that using these essentially these imported or invasive forms is muddying or messing up these speech levels, and especially the differences between exaltation or honorification and deference or lowering. So then the article then starts to focus on what's really bothering the writers of this article, which is women, and the way women in Pyongyang answer their cell phones. And we know, of course, now that cell phones are around, at least in Pyongyang. And especially if you've heard a Korean answer the phone here, they say 여보세요, okay? But apparently this article claims that people are answering the phone by saying 여보시오 and saying it in a non-North Korean kind of way. Deliberate, let's see if I can get to that one. So the 여보시오 and this haneo form are singled out, but then it goes on to say deliberately flirtatious diction. So Seoul speech, especially Seoul women's speech, is branded as somehow flirtatious. Diction of this nature that is meant to appear desirable or cute in the eyes of others is a far cry from the elegant spiritual beauty and beautiful moral demeanor, there's the morality again, of Chosun women, which is supposed to be soft on the outside but tough on the inside. And then with specific reference to these forms in haneo, it says that this is a fussy form, and it blurs the distinction between male and female. So here's another distinction that they feel is being kind of attacked. And it's not our style, it's cunning. So it ends by kind of warning against dragging in, this is their words, dragging in and imitating the speech styles of others without naming those others as South Koreans. So this article then is essentially based on a close reading of this little blurb that came out, and I went back through a lot of the literature back to the 60s in North Korea looking for this stuff, and there's tons of it, as it turns out, essentially telling women how they should talk. Not just women, but there's quite specific when it comes to women. So I think this reveals a series of moral and aesthetic concerns with pronounced gender and affective dimensions. The heightened attention to the moral dimensions of language use comes through loud and clear in all of these North Korean publications, and it's clear from the focus on speech levels and speech level endings that linguistic politeness is a major concern and is tied to morality. So in the paper, I try to make two arguments, but I throw in a third one just for fun, or I try to make a third one. And this is not published. I'm sort of still working on it, so that's why I want to make sure there's time to talk about it at the later. But the first argument concerns this idea that North Korean communist ideology has embraced or has found a way to embrace speech levels. Because if you think about it, there's a paradox. If you're a communist, we're all equal, including women, and in theory, having these kind of hierarchies in language should somehow run counter to communist ideology. So I argue that North Korean communist language ideology has contrived a unique way to not only accommodate the inequalities and asymmetries inherent in Korean honorifics, but to embrace and celebrate them as part of a uniquely indigenous Korean tradition. This is, in essence, Korean tradition trumps communist ideology. So in other words, or to put it another way, in North Korea, honorifics are honorable. Yeah, they're a good thing. They're not dishonorable. And you even in South Korea, you find a lot of Koreans complaining, we shouldn't have honorifics. We're a democracy. We should all be equal. So it's an ongoing debate that goes back to the 1920s. So the next argument concerns this idea that the notion of linguistic etiquette, and there's a huge literature around this in North Korea, is part of a kind of civilizing process. So those of you who have studied some history will know the German sociologist and historian Norbert Elias, who wrote about the civilizing process and how notions of good manners, etiquette, courtesy, table manners, how to have polite conversation, this kind of thing, were part of the process of creating centralized states in Europe. And so I'm arguing that this is a similar sort of process in North Korea, except that with the women, it's almost a civilizing process within a civilizing process where women are being disciplined to be a certain kind of woman in their speech. And so then the third, the sort of plus one argument is, if you look at the literature on where stereotyped registers of women's speech come from, up to now, it's always been connected to capitalism and to commercialism. And so the famous example being Japan and Japanese women's speech, about which there's some really good research saying that this is connected to the rise of kind of 20th century or late 19th century capitalism in Japan. And yet here, I think this is a very different example of a top-down, state-imposed, communist kind of stereotypical women's speech. And the theoretical guidance here that is guiding the research is something called language ideology, a field of research that comes out of linguistic anthropology, which basically studies the beliefs that language users have about the structure of their own language and how they try to connect that to the society they live in. And it's not necessarily correct, but that's not the point. It's what they believe and how that influences culture and society and politics. And a key point here is that language ideologies are systematically related to other areas of cultural discourse, such as the nature of persons, of power, and of a desirable moral order. And in North Korea, we see this in spades. The other point is something called verbal hygiene. This is Deborah Cameron at Oxford University. And she just defines this as, quote, the urge to meddle in matters of language. But more specifically, there's a kind of all of us every day as speakers of a language engage in kinds of verbal hygiene where we make moral and evaluative judgments about the way other people speak, the ways other people speak. So these are kind of the theoretical bits that I'm working with. So let's move to this next section on the most moral race. I don't know if you've seen the book, but my colleague Brian Myers, who teaches here in Korea, wrote a controversial book a few years back called The Cleanest Race, about North Korea, where he quips that, quote, talks about the North Koreans' belief in their innate moral superiority to all other peoples, end quote. And I think we see some of that coming through in the language planning discourse. And I think that this concern with the morality behind how we use politeness in language is coming to the point now in North Korea where it's especially this article that set me on this wild goose chase, that we're seeing a kind of moral panic. Where suddenly, the language is under attack. We're having these invasive forms. It's threatening our women, and normally these kinds of moral panics typically come about during periods where a society is undergoing stress, change, or a crisis of identity. And I think it's pretty obvious that North Korea right now, and has for some time, been going through pretty intense stress as a society. So one of the key language ideological tenets in the North is something called 동방 예의지국, this notion that we Koreans are a nation, we're a people that historically have always been polite, and that we have always observed propriety as a people. And it's somewhat of an invented tradition. You hear it in South Korea too. I had a South Korean taxi driver lay this on me just the other day in a taxi, talking about, oh yeah, we're the nation of propriety in the East. So it's here in the South too, but it's especially conspicuous in the North around this discourse on politeness. And part of the reason is that none other than one of the great leaders himself, this is Kim Jong-il, who they always quote the leaders, and anytime you see an article, it starts off with a quote by either Kim Jong-il or Kim Il-sung. Well, Kim Jong-il is quoted frequently in these articles saying, quote, with our language, one can express etiquette precisely. Herein lies one of the reasons that our nation is called the nation of propriety in the East. So this is something that North Koreans have kind of drilled into them clearly in their education. Or another article, North Korean articles, if you read these journals, all you need to do is read the title. And then you already know what the article says. This one, the title is, and it's from 1998, quote, the ethno-national superiority of Korean women with their correct etiquette and morality. And so that's kind of a big burden to put on the shoulders of North Korean women, as if they were, sort of carrying the ball on all this. So that's the Korean women. The connection to morality goes on. I've already mentioned Deborah Cameron, and she talks about this notion of evaluative metalinguistic discourse, and she says, which she says has a moral dimension that goes far beyond its overt subject to touch on deep desires and fears. So in a way, you can read through this language planning discourse to maybe tease out some of the North Korean regime's deepest fears. We don't want to read too much into this. I'm not saying that we should base policy on what I'm talking about tonight. Typical example of one of the writers of these kinds of articles, he has an article on socialist language morality where he says, quote, "Language morality is a precondition for the establishment of a wholesome and elegant moral ethos across the entire society." Okay, so this, it's meant. This is something that's pervasive, and it's a prerequisite to doing everything else morally in the society. Well, then what about North Korean-style politeness morality? Well, these articles all connect it to the revolution, which is supposed to be ongoing. Another typical example. So an article from 2004 where the author says that observing Korean-style propriety or morality blocks the invasion of bourgeois lifestyles. So again, there's this notion that we're trying to fend off something from the outside. And then this is another North Korean journal that I've kind of gone through quite a bit called Chosun Nyosung, meaning Korean women. An article from 2003 which says, quote, "Only those with elegant morals in their language life and in their cultural life can be true revolutionaries." Okay, so this is what is being fed to everybody in the sort of official publications. Another key aspect that I suppose is unique to North Korea in this regard is we all know about the cult of personality, the cult of the great leaders, and so on. Well, here's an article from 2007, Language Morality Vis-a-vis the Leader, the Core of a Socialist Language Morality. So you have to actually use certain forms, certain endings, certain postpositions that are more or less reserved for the Kim family, especially for Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. And women in particular, it is their job to make sure that their children learn the proper use of these honorific forms. And there they are. There's ke, there's keso, the honorific she, which tends to, in print anyway, get used specifically with regard to the leaders. So in all of this, there's a sort of a heavy burden placed on women. The other thing is, if you look at North Korean propaganda, it's the women who are always wearing hanbok. They're the ones wearing traditional dress. And so this notion that the women are supposed to maintain certain beautiful traditions, one of which is the politeness that is so special about our language. So as you go through these dozens and dozens of articles that have come out over the decades and which continue to come out, there are certain keywords and tropes and metaphors that just keep recurring. That when you add them all up, if you put them all together, you end up with an image of what it is that the official North Korean sort of discourse or the North Korean state thinks its women should sound like when they speak Korean. And informing this is a notion of this Munhwa Sung, and I said that they don't call their language the Pyojuno, they don't call it a standard language, they call it the cultured language, the Munhwa-o. I think this goes back to the early days when they still had Russians sort of building their initial sort of cultural policies, and it's a Russian idea of this idea of kulturnist and how do you act kulturna. We can talk about that later. But another key bit that comes up is something called ususang or uwasang. These are also very key words in South Korea. I invite all of you, when you go back home, if you can type in Hangul, go do a Google search and search for the word ususang, and every single hit you get will be about, in South Korea, will be about Hangul. This idea of superiority and excellence. And in the North as well, this idea that our language is so excellent, and the implication being that it's better than all the others. And one of the reasons it is so is because we have this amazing system of linguistic etiquette. In the South, it's more about the script. In the North, a little bit less of that. And coupled with that, in North Korea, North Korean linguistics, which is not exactly a scientific or sort of very, what's the word I'm looking for, rigorous field, for the last 20 years, what North Korean linguists do is they write articles about this or that ethno-national characteristic in the language. They find something and say, this is something that's really special to Korean, and they write articles about it. They even write articles about how Koreans used to write classical Chinese in a really special way that only Koreans would do. So, if we get to the descriptors now, here's the first list. So if you are a woman in North Korea, all of these articles, any one article will focus on 2 or 3 descriptors, but you add them all up and there's a couple dozen. So you're supposed to be courteous, polite, respectful, modest, frugal, refined. Your speech is supposed to sort of have sentiment in it. Of course, it has to be beautiful. It has to be gentle. It needs to be delicate and have subtlety. And then another long list, it needs to be neat and tidy. It has to create harmony with those around you. It needs a sense of intimacy. It has to be soft. It has to be sensitive. It needs to be docile. It needs to be warm, full of affection. Always, making sure you're not treading on anybody's toes, and so somewhat reserved. It's got to be moral, and then of course it's got to be revolutionary, or else it's not right. So that's a really tall order if you're a woman in North Korea and you've been brought up in this discourse. If I were a woman in North Korea, I'd be afraid to open my mouth. And it gets worse because the great leader himself has spoken on this. So another quote that comes up frequently in these articles is from Kim Il-sung himself, where he says, women should be womanlike. Ladies should be ladylike. And the 녀성 나와야 한다. Courteous, plain, and simple speech, actions and comportment raise one's dignity and make it possible to be respected and trusted. So, from the font of wisdom itself, we have Kim Il-sung defining how women are supposed to talk. And as it turns out, if you go through the literature, some of the actual guidelines are incredibly detailed. So you will find articles instructing women how women should write poetry to sound like a woman's poem, where they tell you exactly what kind of vowels you should use. Korean has vowel harmony, and certain vowels are perceived as being lighter and more feminine, where you have an alternation, as opposed to the other side where it's considered darker and more masculine. And so, or how to manipulate the consonants, because if you've studied some Korean, you know that Korean has these interesting 3-way distinctions in many of the consonants, which can be manipulated almost like riffing, like a kind of jazz riff. You can play off them, and it has gender connotations. So there's articles about this for women trying to write poetry. There are also a number of articles about what's called 애두름법, which means basically indirectness or euphemism. And the long and short of these articles is essentially that women should never give orders. Women should never tell someone what to do. And so in other words, instead of saying 빨리 떠나세요, that's not good. You should say 떠나실 시간이 되었는데요. It's time to go. Not go, but it's time to go now. And so you'll see articles with this kind of guideline for women. But the thing that comes up most repeatedly is this question of 반말, or the idea of forms that have been stripped of the polite yo, and the fact that the yo, the final yo, the polite yo, is really exclusively a woman's form. And that used to be the case in South Korea too. When I was learning Korean, of course, almost all of the teachers of Korean as a foreign language are women. And so many of the foreigners who learn Korean learn it from women, and even in South Korea end up sounding a bit effeminate in their Korean because they use yo too much. But it's much more accentuated in the North. And the sort of the feminine qualities of yo have been much sort of, what's the word I want, bleached in the South. But in the North, all of the literature says yo is for women, okay? So regardless of age, everybody should avoid panmal, and yo is primarily a feminine politeness marker, is what the North Korean sources tell you. Article about this that I found goes back to 1961, which you think about it, I mean, that's not so long after, after the country's split. So there's an article in this Rodongja, the North Korean journal from 1961 about a wife's tasks in the home. And there's this example of a woman, of a wife speaking to her husband. And she says, 여보, 난 정말 따분해서 못 견디겠어. Which means something, honey, this is just driving me nuts. And then the writer of this article says, this is all wrong. He says, that's a male form. What she should have said is, 여보, 난 정말 따분해서 못 견디겠어요, with the yo, okay? This is 1961, and this is still very much being preached in the North today. So this is a typical cover of this women's journal from North Korea, the Chosun Yasang. This is a 2008 journal, but the year before, this particular journal carried this lovely little cartoon of a gentleman there on the left knocking at the door of this woman's household, and he says, 안녕하십니까, that's a nice formal form, very polite. And she says, 누구나, and it's like, and who might you be? And then there's a little boy there below goes, yo, because she left off the yo, okay? So he's correcting her. So next frame, the gentleman says, 세대주와 한 직장에 있습니다. Oh, I work at the same place as your husband. And she goes, 나갔는데, he's not at home, but no yo, okay? It's not, and so the little boy says, yo, right? Next one, 몇 시쯤 돌아옵니까? So about, when approximately will he be home? She goes, 글쎄. And the little boy goes, yo. You're not using your yo. Next frame, and she looks down at the kid then and says, 넌 누군데 아까부터 yo 해. And so who are you that you're not, that you sit there all, the whole time saying yo. And he says below, I've been listening here the whole time, and I'm just helping you out by putting the yos in for you. And it ought to end there, but it's actually worse, because then she goes, what? She goes, 뭐라고? And then he goes, yo. And then this is in some ways the worst. If you think about it, this completely flies in the face of traditional Korean ideas of respect for a parent, for an elder. This is and this is all male on female. So this is a young boy, with his finger up like this, chastising and telling off this woman about essentially disciplining her because she's not using the yo. And so he says, yo, it always makes you look good. It's just a tiny little syllable, but you got to use it all the time. Well, so that's another good example of that disciplining power. So then you might ask, how are women supposed to speak to their husbands in North Korea? Okay, and so here's another cartoon I found, also 2007, a harmonious married couple at breakfast time. And this is almost, it cracks me up, because the guy, the husband, he starts off with, 어느새 아침 청소를 다 해놨군 그래. That's a really macho form, and there's no yo. And he's speaking kind of panmal to his wife. He's not using any honorifics. He's not being polite. He says, you've done all the morning cleaning up, I see. I was just going to do it myself. Yeah, sure. And then she says, oh, you've been so busy lately at the factory, sort of thing. I got breakfast all ready for you. And she says, 합시다, that's a 합시다 form. Next frame, oh, how did you get ready to her daughter? How did you get ready for kindergarten so quick? He says, oh, daddy did it while you were in the kitchen. And she says, okay, let's go. And he goes, oh, 아니, 신발까지 다 닦아놨구려. Oh my goodness, you've already shined my shoes. But again, it's a very macho, masculine form, and there's no yos, and it's not polite. And she says, okay, and he says, let's go. But in this cartoon, she uses honorifics to her husband, and she's polite. And so these forms, and so it's okay for men to use these forms in hao, which no one uses in the South anymore because it sounds really blunt and rude. I don't know if you've ever seen the Korean dubbed version of The Sound of Music from, like, when was that, the 50s, the 60s? I think there's a scene in there where Christopher Plummer professes his love for, what's her name, the actress in Julie Andrews. Yeah, and he said, when he says "I love you" to her, even in the South Korean version back in the 60s and 70s, he says "사랑하오," which no one would say ever today. But in the North, that's still what you're supposed to say if you're a guy. So, sounding ladylike in Korea. Let me just catch up on my slides. Other things that come up, for example, terms of address. How do you address people? What do you call them? This is a very delicate subject, even in the South, where the what's it called, the Institute of the Korean, the National Institute of the Korean Language. They publish guidelines to help people figure out how to address each other. But in the North, it says that you shouldn't use words like she, or kun, or yang. This is a reactionary trend and a return to the language morality of old society. And if you watch these really fascinating North Korean defector TV shows in the South, which I watch religiously since I've been here the last several months, there's one called 이만갑, 이제 만나러 갑시다, which is full of these North Korean defectors in this kind of talk show format, where language comes up all the time, and they complain. This is, we really don't know how we're supposed to talk to people in the South. It's difficult for us. We need training in this. So it has sort of implications for future reunification, or even just for integration of these, this growing number of defectors. So there are also explicit instructions in these manuals about when it's okay not to sound ladylike, when it's okay to, quote, spit fire. And that is when you are talking about our class enemies, especially the Americans, the American imperialists. And then it gives these great examples of the kinds of speech you can use, which is really quite nasty and really harsh speech, but that's okay because you're talking about the Americans. In that case, your model should be Kim Jong-suk, the first wife of Kim Il-sung and the mother of Kim Jong-il. And then they give quotations of how she would say really terrible things about the Americans. Okay, so I'm just about now to the getting towards the end. So the enemy without. So some of these, many of these articles evince a kind of really palpable anxiety about invasive and presumably South Korean, because they don't mention South Korea, but that's the target, linguistic forms and practices. And in my reading, this starts about 10 years ago. As of about 10 years ago, suddenly there is this kind of pronounced and this new anxiety about South Korean forms. And it's new because earlier you find that it was actually, the target was English. They were worried about, they had other linguistic concerns. So this, for example, this person, Lee Kyung-soon, is concerned about expressions that are not our style, not urishik, not our style. And he singles out these. Momo hashayo, momo haneo, momo hajio. These are considered no-no, they're off limits, and they're invasive, and of course they're South Korean. He goes on to say, the ending shoyo, if you've learned some Korean, say 안녕하세요, it's that seyo, but it's kind of broken down into its constituent bits. It's actually originally hashayo, and if you say hashayo, it's also gendered and feminine in the South. He says the ending shoyo is not only difficult to pronounce, this is true, but has a flirtatious, affective coloring, while the ending in neo, which is all over the place in South Korea, is used without any intention to convey meaning and simply to express surprise, and it does not fit our sensibilities or tastes. It's like, doesn't fit our PV. So let me then sort of wrap up what I've been trying to persuade you of. So I had these two initial arguments, right? So the first argument was about societal attitudes towards honorifics and speech levels. You know, are they honorable or dishonorable? Are they a good thing or are they a bad thing? And then the second was about this idea of a civilizing process as a top-down one, right? So for the first argument, I hope that you're now persuaded that in North Korea, they really think honorifics are a good thing. And they are positively valorized in the North, at least as far as the official discourse goes. And this, again, I think challenges some of the research we've seen today about wanting to always connect honorifics to capitalism. So if you're a Korean speaker, you'll notice in the South here a great deal of what can be called honorific inflation, where suddenly, especially in service industries, the person serving you your latte at Starbucks is suddenly making your coffee honorific and says latte 나오셨습니다, and the coffee gets an honorific. What? You know, that never used to happen 20 years ago. And so, you know, it's true that then that the service industry, commercialism, capitalism embraces certain kinds of honorification, but we've got a case here with North Korea where there's also, the communists are also embracing it for other reasons, okay? So then about the civilizing process, I hope you'll agree with me that that also seems to be happening with women, but specifically to create a kind of state-engineered type of docile femininity. And this is something that Sonia Ryang has already written about, completely unrelated to language. But here we see it in women's speech, and it's supposedly, or it's pitched, it's taught as if this was nonetheless revolutionary, but it's this top-down manipulation of a stereotype notion of what women should sound like. And it's the same things as usual: domesticity and femininity, docility, beauty, softness, which is really strikingly traditional, conservative, and somehow definitely very unfeminist, right? Sonia Ryang, this who I've just quoted, she has already remarked that, quote, seemingly less drastic, less violent, or at least indirectly violent forms of subjugation are more prevalent, more the norm, and hence more effective in North Korea than in other totalitarian societies. So we've more or less talked about women in North Korea. Maybe the point here is that just as in the sort of the economy, and this is true of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe too, women were essentially given a double burden of being producer and reproducer. In North Korea it's the same, but they're also now having to be the ones making sure everybody learns how to be polite, especially to the great leaders. The deepest fears bit, as I mentioned, I've been reading out of the North Korean literature these hints of linguistic anxiety, linguistic unease. And so, for example, already 15 years ago, North Korean linguistic journals had all these articles about language death and linguistic endangerment, where they were essentially saying, oh, English is this kind of bulldozer language killing all these languages, all about English. And there was no sense that Korean was under threat that you could read. But now, with this latest bit, we're seeing a sense that North Korean social linguistic integrity and security is somehow under threat, but the threat is not English, it's South Korean. And so how are they getting that? Well, DVDs, especially USBs, North Koreans, the defectors are telling us all this, they're watching all of K-pop. They are watching all the dramas. And that's where they're getting these forms. And it's very attractive. And then they start using them on the phone, in the bus, on their cell phone, on the bus in Pyongyang. And then this is getting picked up on now. So it makes you wonder, does this cultured language, this special bond that the North has tried to create between language and nation, has this suddenly, is it under threat now, or the North seems to think it's under threat? And if you read some of the research about World War II or just before that, the Nazis and what's called Nazi mother tongue fascism. Nazi mother tongue fascism was animated by the horror of assimilation or the horror of homogenization. And I think we're seeing now the hints in North Korea, just through this language stuff, of a kind of horror of assimilation or a horror of homogenization to South Korean culture through popular culture is what I'm guessing. a kind of homogenization at the hands of an increasingly globalized and invasive South Korean cultural and linguistic presence, as well as concern over the viability of this elaborately contrived concoction of language, culture, nation that they call 문화어, or the cultured language. I also wonder if it's not a form of kind of subtle resistance from these women. This is a kind of sense of transgression to go and use these South Korean forms that they heard behind locked doors, because you're not supposed to watch these South Korean videos. There might be a little bit of that. So finally, topics for future research. There's a lot to be done looking at pre-20th century Joseon Dynasty conduct manuals for women. There are a lot of them about how Joseon women are supposed to behave, including their speech behavior and their sort of speech comportment. Another thing I think that needs research is this. This is all about linguistic divergence. The linguistic divergence now between North and South Korea is far more advanced than it ever became with East and West Germany, right? And so that's a challenge moving forward if ever there will be reunification. And then the caveat, my final caveat is, what I'm talking about today is just prescription. This is what you're supposed to talk like. We don't really know what North Korean women actually sound like in real life. We do know that the North Korean education system has a very, very strong kind of presentational skills kind of focus, so that as soon as you put a North Korean in front of a microphone on TV or whatever, they immediately launch into this kind of presentational mode where everything about the way they speak changes. And you see this if you just watch the North Korean newscaster, you know, the big lady who always is railing against, you know, that kind of speech. So how do North Korean women really speak? Well, you can't just go there and do social linguistic fieldwork. And just talking to North Korean defectors is not the same thing either, because you can't step into the same context twice. They are out of context. So it's in some ways a mystery, but at least I hope to have shown you how the sort of North Korean state at large thinks those women in North Korea should talk. And what happens in the future, well, let's wait and see. Thank you so much.